She arrived at the most powerful ranch in Texas with nothing but an old cast iron skillet, a mother who could barely walk, and a reputation that had followed her like smoke through 3 counties. They said she was trouble. They said no widow survived long on the frontier alone. But what no one told Grayson Hawthorne, the wealthiest cattle baron in the state, was that the woman standing at his gate wasn't running from her past. She was done running entirely. If you want to see what one woman with a skillet did to an empire, like this video, drop your city in the comments and don't go anywhere. The road into Ironwood Estate ran nearly a mile from the front gate to the main house, and Rowan Mercer walked every foot of it. She didn't ride in on a wagon because the wagon had been sold 3 weeks ago outside of Caldwell. She didn't have a letter of introduction, didn't have a reference from a preacher or a former employer, didn't have anything on paper that said she was trustworthy or capable or worth a second look. What she had was a battered leather traveling bag slung over one shoulder, her mother Edith clinging to her other arm with both hands, and a cast iron skillet wrapped in cloth and tucked under her elbow like she meant to use it if anyone gave her cause. Edith moved slowly. Her hip had never healed right after the fall 2 winters back, and the Texas heat didn't help. Every few steps she made a small sound, not quite a complaint, just the sound a body makes when it's working harder than it wants to. Rowan matched her pace without comment. She had learned a long time ago that there was no use rushing her mother, and no use pretending she wasn't struggling. "You sure about this place?" Edith said, squinting up at the main house, which had come into view at the end of the long dirt road. It was enormous. 2 full stories of pale limestone, wide wraparound porches on both levels, a second structure behind it that appeared to be the bunkhouse, and beyond that, fencing and cattle and open land stretching so far it disappeared into the shimmer of the afternoon. "No," Rowan said. Edith looked at her. "No, you're not sure?" "No, I'm not sure. But we're here, so it doesn't matter." They walked the rest of the way in silence. A man was waiting near the front steps when they arrived. Not Grayson Hawthorne himself, but a ranch hand named Curtis, lean and weathered, with a sun-cracked face and the look of someone who had been doing the same job for 20 years and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He looked at Rowan, then at Edith, then at the skillet still tucked under Rowan's arm. "You the woman who sent the letter?" he said. "I am. Mr. Hawthorne's in the east pasture. He'll be back by 4. He glanced again at the skillet. "You want to wait inside?" "If there's a kitchen, I'd rather wait there." Curtis almost smiled. "Almost. Follow me." The kitchen at Ironwood Estate was a large room at the back of the main house with high ceilings, 2 wood-burning stoves, a long preparation table down the center, and more square footage than any kitchen Rowan had ever worked in. It was also, she noted immediately, a disaster. The shelves were disorganized. Flour and salt and cornmeal sat in open sacks with no covers. A cast iron pot with something burned dark along the bottom sat on one of the stoves as if someone had walked away mid-cook and never come back. The preparation table had grease stains in the wood that had clearly been there for months. A single tin cup sat on the windowsill with a dead fly floating in it. Edith made her sound again. The one that wasn't quite a complaint. 40 men? Rowan said. 43 right now, Curtis said from the doorway. We just took on 4 new hands for the drive. And who's been cooking? Dell was cooking. Dell left 6 weeks ago. He paused. Before Dell, it was someone named Hoss. Hoss was asked to leave. Why? He fed a man something that kept him in the outhouse for 4 days. Rowan set her bag down on the floor near the door. She set the skillet on the preparation table. She looked at the room for a long moment, the way someone looks at a problem they're already solving in their head. Is there a cellar? Out back. Smokehouse? South side of the bunkhouse. Ice house? Curtis hesitated. There's one. Hasn't been stocked proper in a while. Root garden? Was one. Got neglected. Rowan nodded slowly. She was taking inventory not just of the kitchen, but of everything that was wrong with it, and everything that could be made right. She was also, although she wouldn't have said it out loud, calculating how hard she was going to have to work to make herself indispensable before anyone decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Could you show my mother somewhere to sit that isn't this floor? She said. And if there's tea, I'd appreciate it. I don't know if there's tea. Then water is fine. Grayson Hawthorne came back at 4:10, not 4 o'clock, and he came back dirty. He was taller than Rowan had expected. She'd built a picture of him in her head from the letter she'd sent and the replies she'd received, and the picture had been of an older man, stocky, maybe a little soft from years of money. The man who walked through the back door of the kitchen was none of those things. He was broad through the shoulders with the kind of hands that had done real physical work for most of his life. And there was mud on his boots and a tear along the left shoulder seam of his shirt that he hadn't bothered to fix or cover. He stopped when he saw Rowan standing at the preparation table where she had already, in the hour she'd been waiting, cleaned the burned pot, wiped down the shelves, covered the open sacks, and disposed of the tin cup. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen. He looked back at her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne." He pulled off his hat and set it on a hook near the door. "You've been in here an hour." "About that." "Already cleaning." It needed it. He sat down heavily at the end of the preparation table, not in a chair, just on the edge of the table itself, like a man who was more comfortable doing that than finding a chair. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked tired in the way that men look tired when they are carrying too many things and have been carrying them for too long. "Your letter said you cooked for a boarding house in Henrietta for 2 years," he said. "I did." "Before that?" "Before that, I cooked for my husband's logging camp outside of Decatur. 14 men, 3 meals a day, 6 days a week." "Your husband passed." 8 months ago." She said it without flinching, which was something she had practiced. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had learned that the moment a widow flinched at the mention of her husband's death, the person across from her started making decisions out of pity. She didn't want pity. Pity was useless. Grayson nodded slowly. "I heard there was some trouble in Decatur. After." There it was. Rowan had known it would come up. It always came up. She had told herself on the walk down the road that she would answer directly, without explanation or apology, because over-explaining was the same as flinching. "There was," she said. "My husband's brother decided he wanted the logging camp. He told people I'd been stealing from the operation to cover it. None of it was true, but when a man with property makes a claim in a small town, the woman without property rarely wins the argument. So you left." "I left. Went to Caldwell. Someone from Decatur came through Caldwell and told people I'd been run out, so I left Caldwell." She let a beat pass. "I'm here now." Grayson looked at her for a long time. He had pale gray eyes, unusual, unexpected, and the kind of stillness about him that either meant he was very calm or very controlled. She couldn't tell which yet. "I've got 43 men who need 3 meals a day," he said. "Breakfast before dawn, dinner at midday out to the pasture or the barn, depending on where they're working, supper at 6. I've got a cattle drive starting in 3 weeks that's going to pull 20 of those men out for 6 weeks, and the men who stay behind will be working twice as hard as usual." "I understand." "The kitchen's been in poor shape. You can see that." "I can. I've had trouble keeping a cook 2 in 2 years, he paused. "The men are not always easy." "Men rarely are," Rowan said, "but hungry men are worse." Something shifted slightly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close. "There's a room off the back of the kitchen," he said. "Small. Your mother could take the room next to it. We use it for storage now, but we can clear it out." He stood up from the table. "Wages are $12 a month. Meals covered, of course. If you need supplies, you put in a list and I'll have Curtis take it to town." "The supply list is going to be significant at first," Rowan said. "I expect so. And I'll need to reorganize the cellar and the smokehouse." "Fine. And the root garden wants replanting. I can do it, but I'll need seeds and someone to help me turn the soil." Grayson looked at her with a particular expression. She would come to recognize it over the weeks that followed, that look of mild surprise held very carefully in check. "You've been here an hour," he said. "I've been thinking for 3 days," she said, "since I got your reply." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked his hat up from the hook. "Curtis will show you the supply room. You start in the morning." He paused at the door. "Breakfast for 43 men before first light." "I know," she said. He left. And Rowan stood in the kitchen by herself and breathed out slowly and felt the particular feeling that came after a thing was decided. Not relief exactly, not yet. Something more like the moment before a storm, when the air changes and you know what's coming and there is nothing left to do but get ready. The first morning was a disaster, and she had known it would be. She had been up since 3, working by lamplight, taking inventory of what was actually in the cellar versus what should have been. The discrepancies were considerable. Someone, or possibly several someones over the months since Dell left, had been helping themselves to whatever they felt like from the stores without recording anything. Rowan had found half-empty sacks, mislabeled containers, and a crock of what appeared to be lard that had gone rancid sometime in the recent past. She set the rancid lard outside the back door and worked around the rest. Breakfast for 43 men required a certain scale of operation that a single person could not achieve perfectly on a first attempt in an unfamiliar kitchen with inadequate supplies. She knew this. She made cornbread in both stoves simultaneously, fried bacon in batches, scrambled eggs from the coop out back, and produced a large pot of coffee that was, admittedly, stronger than ideal because she had misjudged the ratio. The men came through at first light. They were loud, they were half awake, and they were not particularly interested in being polite to anyone, let alone a woman they hadn't asked for and didn't know. The first sign of trouble was a man named Briggs. He was wide, wider than Grayson, shorter, with a thick red beard and the particular expression of a man who had decided before he arrived that he wasn't going to like whatever was in front of him. He picked up his plate, looked at the food, set it back down. "What's this?" he said. "Breakfast," Rowan said. "Dell used to do bacon proper, crispy. This isn't crispy." "Dell isn't here." There was a pause across the long table. Several men watched without turning their heads. "I don't want soft bacon," Briggs said. Rowan looked at him steadily. She had cooked for logging camp men. She had cooked for boarding house men. She knew this type. She also knew that how she handled the next 30 seconds would determine a great deal about the next several months. "Then you can cook your own," she said pleasantly. "The pan's right there." Briggs stared at her. A few men at the far end of the table made sounds that were not quite laughs. "I'm just saying," Briggs started. "I heard what you said," Rowan told him. "I made 43 portions of breakfast in an unfamiliar kitchen on 4 hours of sleep. If you have suggestions for improvement, I'm happy to hear them at a reasonable time and in a reasonable tone. If you'd like to complain about the texture of your bacon, you can do it somewhere else. Other men are trying to eat." Briggs picked up his fork. He ate. He didn't say anything else. At the end of the table, a man named Hector, older, with gray at his temples and calloused hands that told a long story, caught Rowan's eye and gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen. She filed it away. The first week was a study in controlled chaos. She reorganized the shelves. She put in her first supply list, which was long and detailed and included notations about why each item was needed, because she had learned that men with money needed to understand they weren't being robbed, they were being managed. She replanted the root garden with seeds she put on the supply list and spent 2 evenings on her knees in the dirt with Edith sitting in a chair nearby, doing what Edith could do, which was talking and remembering things about plants that Rowan occasionally needed to hear. "Your grandmother could grow anything," Edith said on the second evening. Rowan said. "She'd have this place sorted in a week. It's going to take more than a week. I know that." Edith watched her daughter work. "You're not sleeping enough." "I'm sleeping as much as I can." "That's not what I said." Rowan sat back on her heels and looked at her mother. Edith was 71 years old, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with a lifetime of loss behind her that had somehow not made her small. It had made her different, quieter than she used to be, slower, but not small. "I'm fine," Rowan said. "You've always said that when you weren't." "Then why do you ask?" Edith smiled at her. "Because sometimes you are." But by the end of the first week, she had solved the breakfast problem. By the end of the second, she had worked out a midday system that allowed her to send meals out to wherever the men were working. Not a permanent solution, but functional. And had started producing suppers that the men talked about afterward. Not loudly, not to her directly, but she heard things through walls and across tables, and what she heard was the particular quiet of men who had just eaten well and were not inclined to complain. Grayson Hawthorne said very little to her in those first 2 weeks. He ate with the men at supper, not always, but often. And he observed things. She noticed that about him. He watched. He didn't appear to be watching, but he was. She had the same habit herself, and she recognized it. The one conversation that mattered in those first weeks happened on a Thursday evening, after supper, when she was cleaning the kitchen alone and he came in from outside. "The men are talking about the food," he said. She waited. "Good things," he added, as if she might have thought otherwise. "I know," she said. "I can tell when men are unhappy. They get loud. When they're happy, they get quiet." He considered this. "Is that your experience, or is that—" "Experience," she said. "It's always experience." He nodded. He was about to leave, then paused. "That business with Briggs, the first morning." "Yes. How you handled it." He seemed to be searching for a word. "That was right." "I know," she said again. He left without answering, which was, she was beginning to understand, a kind of answer in itself. What no one at Ironwood Estate knew yet, what Rowan had not told Grayson in the interview and had no particular plan to volunteer, was how close she had actually come to not making it here at all. The 8 months between Daniel's death and her arrival at Ironwood had been the hardest of her life, and she had not lived an easy life to begin with. The brother-in-law, Walter, had moved quickly. He'd had legal papers drawn up within 2 weeks of the funeral that she hadn't fully understood at the time, and by the time she understood them, her name had been attached to accusations she couldn't disprove in a town that wasn't interested in her side of things. She had left Decatur with Edith, $43, and what she could carry. She had cooked at a boarding house in Caldwell for 3 months before a man passing through recognized her and started talking. She had left Caldwell on a Wednesday night with less money than she'd arrived with because the boarding house owner had docked her pay for what he called the disruption. She had sat in a livery stable on the edge of a town whose name she didn't want to remember, listening to her mother sleep, and thought seriously about what her options were. They were few. They were not encouraging. She had $2.60 and a cast iron skillet that had belonged to her grandmother, and then her mother, and then her, and the skillet was the only thing she owned that she was entirely certain she would never sell. The Ironwood listing had come from a month-old newspaper that someone had left in the livery. She had read it twice, written the letter that evening by the light of someone else's lantern, and spent 3 weeks not thinking about whether she'd get a reply, because hoping too hard for a specific outcome was a kind of trap she had fallen into before. The reply had come to a general store in the next town. 2 paragraphs. Businesslike, brief, neither warm nor cold. An interview, if she could present herself at Ironwood Estate by a certain date. She had walked a significant portion of the way. None of this she told anyone at Ironwood, because it wasn't their business and because the story of how badly things had gone for her was not the story she intended to define herself by. She had a kitchen. She had a room. She had work that was hard and real and that she was good at. That was the story she was writing now. By the end of the 3rd week, the supply list she'd submitted had come back partially filled. Curtis had done the town run. And she had identified 2 things. First, that the merchant who supplied most of the estate's dry goods was charging Hawthorne considerably more than market rate, possibly because he assumed a wealthy man wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. Second, that there was a farmer less than 4 miles from the estate who grew corn and kept chickens, and had no established supply relationship with anyone in the area. She brought this to Grayson on a Saturday morning, when she knew from 3 weeks of observation that he went over the ranch accounts before the afternoon. She knocked on the door of his study. "Come in." She went in. He was at his desk, papers in front of him, the kind of organized mess that meant a person knew where everything was, even if no one else could tell. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'd like to talk to you about the supply arrangements." He looked up. "Sit down." She sat. She laid out what she had found, the pricing discrepancy, the farmer nearby, and a rough estimate of what a direct arrangement with the farmer would save on eggs and corn alone over the course of a year. She didn't make assumptions or dramatize. She laid out numbers. Grayson listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "Yes." "And you've been tracking the supply pricing." "I track everything," she said. "It's how I know if I'm doing my job or just filling time." He looked at the paper she'd put in front of him. She'd written the numbers out cleanly, not because she thought he needed help reading them, but because it was easier to make a point when the evidence was in front of a person's eyes. "Set up the arrangement with the farmer," he said. "What's his name?" "Alderman. Tobias Alderman." Tell Curtis to go with you when you speak to him, and put together a list of any other suppliers you think we should be looking at. I already have. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was getting to know, the held-back surprise. Of course you do, he said. She stood. She was at the door when he spoke again. Mrs. Mercer. Yes? The men are working better, he said. You might not see it from the kitchen, but when men eat well, they work better. 3 weeks of actual meals instead of whatever Dell was doing. He paused. It's noticeable. Rowan nodded. She didn't say anything to that because what was there to say? She left him to his accounts and went back to her kitchen, and if she felt something quiet and solid settle in her chest as she walked, she kept that to herself too. But Ironwood Estate was not a forgiving place for a woman trying to hold her ground, and she had not yet begun to understand the full weight of what was building around her. Briggs had not forgotten the first morning. He had not said anything else directly. He wasn't, she was coming to understand, the type who made frontal attacks when sideways ones were available. He talked to other men. He made small remarks in spaces she wasn't quite in, loud enough to carry, quiet enough to deny. She wasn't strong enough for this kind of work. She was going to burn out by the drive. A woman running a kitchen this size was a risk the ranch didn't need. And then there was something larger, something she didn't yet have full knowledge of, but could feel at the edges of things. A tension in the way Curtis spoke about town sometimes, the way certain supply delays were explained with unusual vagueness. A man named Calloway had been watching the estate from the outside for longer than Rowan had been there. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he wanted, but she would. For now, she had a kitchen to run, 43 men to feed, and a garden that needed watering. She picked up her skillet, her grandmother's skillet, her mother's skillet, hers, and she got back to work. The arrangement with Tobias Alderman took one conversation and a handshake. He was a quiet man, mid-50s, with soil permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and the careful manner of someone who had been ignored by larger operations for long enough that he'd stopped expecting anything from them. When Rowan arrived with Curtis and laid out what she was proposing, a regular weekly order, fair price, paid promptly on delivery, he looked at her for a long moment, as if waiting for the part where it stopped being a good deal. That's it, he said. That's it, Rowan said. I need eggs, corn, and whatever root vegetables you can spare through the summer. I need them on time, and I need them consistent. In return, Ironwood pays you what they're actually worth, not what Heller's been charging us to move them. Alderman glanced at Curtis. Curtis shrugged in a way that meant this was her arrangement, not his. All right, Alderman said. First delivery Thursday. He delivered on Thursday. He delivered the Thursday after that. By the third week, he had started including extras. A bundle of dried herbs once, that he said his wife grew and had more of than they needed. Rowan used them in the supper that evening, and Hector, the older cowboy with the gray temples, asked what was in the stew that made it taste different. Time, she said. He nodded as if this were important information. Good, he said, and went back to eating. Small things. But on a ranch, small things compounded. What Rowan had not anticipated, or had anticipated and pushed to the back of her mind because there was too much else to manage, was how quickly the money she was saving Ironwood Estate would become visible to the people who had been profiting from the old arrangements. Fletcher Heller ran the largest dry goods operation in Merritt County, and he had been supplying Ironwood Estate for the better part of 6 years. He was not a man who lost accounts quietly. She didn't know this yet when she submitted her second revised supply list to Curtis and noted, matter-of-factly, that she had found 3 additional direct suppliers for items previously sourced through Heller's operation. She was thinking about the kitchen, the accounts, the numbers. She was not thinking about Fletcher Heller's reputation, or his temper, or the particular set of relationships he had built across the county over 6 years of making himself indispensable to the people with the most money. She would begin thinking about him soon enough. The cattle drive took 22 men out in the last week of June, not 20 as originally planned, because 2 additional hands had been hired on and Grayson had decided they were ready. He went with them. He was not the kind of owner who stayed behind while his men worked, which Rowan had figured out about him early and respected in the private accounting she kept of people's character. Before he left, he stopped in the kitchen the evening before departure. She was preparing the next morning's breakfast. Most of it could be done the night before if you were organized about it. And he came in still wearing his hat, which meant he was just passing through, not staying. 21 men staying behind, he said. Tanner's in charge of the ranch operations while I'm gone. Any problems with supplies or the kitchen, you go to him. All right. Tanner's a fair man, Grayson added. It seemed like he was saying it to reassure her, though she hadn't asked. He won't give you trouble. I didn't think he would, Rowan said. She was cutting potatoes. She didn't stop. Grayson watched her for a moment. Briggs is staying behind, he said. He's better at the close work than the drive. She kept cutting. I know. You're not concerned about that. I'm concerned about feeding 21 men for 6 weeks on a tighter supply schedule with you gone, and about getting the root garden through the summer heat, and about the fact that the south stove has been pulling unevenly for 2 weeks, and I think there's something wrong with the flu. She set down the knife and looked at him. Briggs is a man with an attitude. I've dealt with those before. I don't lose sleep over them. Yes. Grayson was quiet for a second. The flu. Tell Curtis before he leaves tomorrow. He can get someone to look at it. I already told him he's getting Donner from the bunkhouse to check it Friday. Another one of those held-back expressions. Right, he said. Have a safe drive, Mr. Hawthorne. He nodded. He left. And the next morning, before first light, she heard the horses and the cattle and the low voices of men moving out, and she was already at the stove by then, and she didn't watch them go because there was breakfast to finish. The first 3 weeks with the reduced crew were quieter than she expected. 21 men was a manageable number. She adjusted portions, adjusted her supply orders accordingly, and used the slightly reduced load to do things she hadn't had time for yet. Scrubbing the walls of the kitchen, reorganizing the cellar so that finding anything in it no longer required a search party, and spending an extra hour each week on the root garden, which was responding slowly but genuinely to the attention she'd been giving it. Edith helped with the garden more than Rowan had asked her to. Her hip was bad, but she could sit on a low stool and do the close work, thinning seedlings, checking soil, and she seemed to want the purpose of it. You're doing too much, Rowan told her one morning, finding her already outside before breakfast was even served. I'm doing exactly enough, Edith said, not looking up from the row of beans she was checking. Go feed your men. It was in the 4th week that Briggs started, not openly. That wasn't his way. He operated in the spaces between things. The conversation that went quiet when Rowan walked through the bunkhouse yard, the complaints that found their way to Tanner's ear through intermediaries, the small resistances that were just small enough to be deniable. He started showing up to meals late, which forced her to hold food warm past its best point. He started sending other men to ask questions about the kitchen on his behalf. Could the supper be later? Could the coffee be stronger? Could the bread be different? Questions that on their own were reasonable, but collectively added up to a campaign. She fed the men. She answered the reasonable questions. She documented the rest. The documentation was something she'd started in Decatur after everything with Walter. She kept a small notebook in the kitchen, tucked behind the flour sacks, and she wrote things down. Dates, names, what was said, what was requested, what was delivered. Not because she planned to do anything with it immediately, but because she had learned the hard way that when a situation turned bad, the person without records was always at a disadvantage. It was Hector who told her what was being said. He came to her on a Tuesday evening after the other men had cleared out of the dining area. He didn't make ceremony of it, just came up to where she was wiping down the preparation table and stood there until she looked at him. Briggs has been talking to some of the newer men, he said, telling them the kitchen's not being run right, that supplies are being wasted, that the money you're spending is more than it should be. Rowan kept wiping the table. Is that what he's saying? That's the short version. Hector pulled out a chair and sat, uninvited, which told her he was serious about this. He was not a man who sat down uninvited. He's also been in contact with Heller in town. Someone who works at the feed store told Donner, who told me. She stopped wiping. What kind of contact? Don't know exactly, but Heller's been asking around about Ironwood's supply arrangements. Who you've been dealing with, what you've been paying. He paused. Heller doesn't like losing accounts. Rowan thought about this for a moment. It was one thing to deal with a difficult ranch hand. It was another to deal with a man with money and connections and a reason to be actively hostile. Thank you, she said. Hector, he said, because she still sometimes forgot his name when she was thinking. I know your name, Hector, she said. Thank you. He nodded and left, and she stood in the kitchen for a while after, not wiping anything, just thinking. She wrote Grayson a letter that evening, not a panic letter, not a request for rescue. A business letter, the way she would have written to anyone who needed to be kept informed about their own interests. She laid out what Hector had told her, what she had observed of Briggs, and what she knew of Heller's likely motivation. She included in the letter the same supply numbers she had given Grayson before he left. The comparison between what they'd been paying through Heller's operation and what they were paying now through direct suppliers, because she wanted it on record that the new arrangements were saving money, not wasting it. She gave the letter to the writer who went out to the drive camp every week with mail and supplies. Then she went back to running the kitchen. She could not afford to let her focus split. That was another thing she had learned the hard way. When someone was trying to destabilize you, the worst thing you could do was let it show in your work. Because the work was the argument. The work was the only thing that couldn't be taken out of context or misrepresented. So she cooked. She managed the supplies. She spent Saturday afternoon of the 5th week renegotiating the arrangement with the man who had been delivering their salt and dried goods from the north, because she had found a supplier 2 counties over who charged 15 cents less per pound. The difference on a monthly order was not dramatic, but it was real, and real money added to real money in a way that mattered. She also, during this same period, quietly figured out what had been wrong with the ranch accounts before her arrival. It wasn't something she'd gone looking for. She had been checking the kitchen supplies against what she was spending, which meant comparing her records against the main supply ledger that Curtis kept in the tack room. She'd gone to cross-reference a delivery from 6 weeks before her arrival. She wanted to know what Dell had been ordering and at what price, to understand the baseline she'd been working from. What she found was that the discrepancy in Heller's pricing wasn't new. It had been going on for at least 3 years, based on what was in the ledger versus what the going market rate had been during those same periods. Heller had been overcharging Ironwood Estate on a regular basis, not dramatically, not so much that an owner not looking closely would notice, but consistently. She did the arithmetic in her head, which took her a while because the numbers were not small. She put her estimate in her notebook and said nothing to anyone. Briggs made his move on a Thursday. It was the 5th week of the drive, and she was carrying a large pot of midday stew out to the side yard where the men ate when the weather allowed, and Briggs appeared around the corner of the bunkhouse. He was not coming from any direction that suggested he'd been working. I need to talk to you, he said. Rowan kept walking. The pot was heavy. I'm in the middle of something. I've been thinking, Briggs said, falling into step beside her, which was either oblivious or deliberately provocative, that this setup isn't working. What setup? You, the kitchen. He said it flatly, like he was delivering a fair assessment. The men liked Dell better. Dell knew how to work with people. Dell is gone, Rowan said. She set the pot down on the outdoor table and straightened up. Several men who were already there looked at their hands, which meant they could hear this. And I don't know what Dell knew about working with people, but I know what I know about feeding them, which is what I was hired to do. There are complaints, Briggs said, about the food, about the way the kitchen is run, about— Tell me one man at this table who has a complaint, Rowan said. Briggs looked at the table. Nobody said anything. Tell me one man, she said again, evenly, who has complained to me directly. Not through you, not through someone else, directly. The silence held. Briggs's jaw tightened. That's not the point. The point, Rowan said, is that you lost something when I reorganized the supply arrangements, and I don't know yet exactly what it was, but I intend to find out. She picked up the serving ladle. If you'd like lunch, sit down. If you'd like to keep doing this, wait until I finish serving. Briggs stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Anger, mostly, but also something else. Calculation. He was a man who wanted to win, and he was beginning to realize that the direct approach wasn't going to work on her. He sat down. She served lunch. But she had said the thing about losing something without entirely knowing why she'd said it, and that evening she went back through her notebook with the Heller pricing estimates and the supply ledger, and she started thinking about who had been placing the orders before she arrived. It had been Dell, and before Dell, Haas. But the supply orders hadn't been in Dell's handwriting in the ledger. They'd been in someone else's. The same handwriting, consistent across 3 years of records. She checked the ledger again in the tack room the next morning while Curtis was out with the horses. The handwriting on the supply orders, cross-referenced against the ranch account entries. Briggs had been managing the supply orders. Not the cooking, that had been Dell and Haas, but the ordering, meaning Briggs had known what Heller was charging, meaning Briggs had been part of an arrangement that was costing Ironwood estate money every month for 3 years. Meaning when she had reorganized the supply chain and cut Heller out, she had not just cost Heller an account, she had cost Briggs something too. She didn't know yet if it was a formal arrangement or just an informal kickback, Heller throwing some benefit Briggs's way for steering the orders through him. But it was something, and the something was gone now, and that was why Briggs had been working against her from the start. She added the relevant pages to her notebook, dates, entries, handwriting samples, and went back to the kitchen. She didn't confront Briggs again. She didn't go to Tanner, not yet. She waited because she had learned that moving too early on information was how you wasted it. The letter she'd sent to Grayson came back with a reply at the end of the 5th week. It was longer than his previous communications, still businesslike but with a different quality to it. She could tell he'd written it in some haste, probably at the end of a long day on the drive, because the handwriting was less even than the first reply she'd received from him months ago. He confirmed he had received her assessment. He said that Heller had been, in his words, difficult to deal with before, and that he wasn't surprised the man was making noise. He said that her arrangement with Alderman and the other direct suppliers had been the right call, and that he intended to maintain it when he returned. He asked her to continue documenting anything that seemed relevant, and then at the end, which was not like him at all based on what she knew of him so far. I appreciate your writing to me. Things have gone well here, but I have found myself more than once thinking about how the estate is running without me able to see it. The fact that I am not more concerned is due largely to you. She read that last sentence twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept her own correspondence, and she did not think about it as much as she might have because there was a stove that needed managing and supper for 21 men in 3 hours. But she didn't throw it away. Boy, Fletcher Heller arrived at Ironwood Estate on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week of the drive. He came in a good wagon with a good horse, which told you something about how he thought of himself. He was a well-kept man, not fat exactly, but comfortable, with the particular softness of someone who had not done physical labor in some years. He had a smile that he deployed with precision. Rowan was in the kitchen when Curtis told her there was a visitor asking for whoever was in charge. Tanner's in the south pasture, Curtis said. Briggs told him you'd be the one to speak to. She noted that. Briggs had told him. Of course he had. She took off her apron and went out. Heller was standing in the yard near his wagon, and when he saw her, he did a visible recalibration. Whatever he'd expected, it hadn't been a woman in her mid-30s with flowers still on her wrist and the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something and knew it. "Mrs. Mercer?" he said, making it almost a question. "Yes?" "Fletcher Heller, I used to supply dry goods to this estate." He spread his hands in a gesture meant to communicate openness and goodwill. "I was hoping to speak with someone about reinstating that arrangement." "Mr. Hawthorne isn't here," Rowan said. "I understand that, but perhaps we could talk about—" "I manage the kitchen supply arrangements," she said. "If you have a proposal, I'll hear it." He smiled. Of course. I just thought in the interest of, well, we've had a long relationship with Ironwood, and I think perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about our pricing." "There hasn't been," she said. "I compared your rates against current market prices across 3 counties. The discrepancy is consistent and has been consistent for at least 3 years based on the ledger records." The smile dimmed fractionally. "Well, pricing is complicated, and delivery costs are the same as they are for every other supplier, since you're not delivering from further away than Alderman, and he charges considerably less." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Heller, if you'd like to submit a proposal for supplying specific items at competitive rates, you can do that in writing, and Mr. Hawthorne will review it when he returns. I'm not in a position to commit the estate to any new arrangements in his absence." Heller's eyes moved briefly to the bunkhouse, and she knew without looking that Briggs was somewhere in her peripheral vision. "I appreciate your position," Heller said carefully. But I do think Mr. Hawthorne might see things differently once he has a fuller picture of what, she said. He paused. Of the situation here, with the estate's finances, with the changes that have been made. I can give you a fuller picture right now, Rowan said. In the 7 weeks since I reorganized the supply arrangements, the estate has reduced its monthly supply expenditure by approximately 22%, while increasing the quantity and quality of food produced. I have documentation of every transaction. If Mr. Hawthorne wants to compare that against the previous 3 years of ledger records, he is welcome to do so. Heller said nothing for a moment. The smile was gone entirely now. In its place was the face of a man who was angry and was deciding what to do with that anger. I hope you understand, he said quietly, that this region is a small place, and that relationships in a small place are important. I understand that very well, Rowan said. She held his gaze. He was the kind of man who assumed women would look away first. She didn't. Good day, Mr. Heller, she said. He went back to his wagon. He drove out. And Rowan went back to her kitchen without looking toward wherever Briggs was standing, because she didn't need to see his face to know what it looked like. She picked up her skillet from the hook where she kept it. She moved it with her, always. It was a habit by now. And she set it on the stove and started on the afternoon bread. And she thought about what Heller had said. Relationships in a small place are important. He had meant it as a warning. She had taken it as information, because relationships worked in both directions, and she had spent 7 weeks building them, with Alderman, with the other suppliers, with Hector and the older hands, with Curtis in the particular way that a person builds trust with someone who doesn't give it easily. She had also been sending correct numbers to Grayson Hawthorne every week in her kitchen accounts, and he had been reading them, and the record she was building was not a record that could be easily argued against. Heller could make noise. He could spread whatever version of events suited him. But she had the ledgers, and she had the math, and she had 7 weeks of a kitchen running better than it had in years. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She shaped the bread loaves and slid them into the oven and thought about Briggs and what she knew, and when the time would be right to do something with it. Not yet. The drive wasn't back yet. Grayson wasn't here, and some conversations needed to happen when the right person was in the room. Not yet. But soon. The oven heat came up strong and even. Donner had fixed the flue, and the kitchen smelled of bread, and outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch continuing its work, and Rowan Mercer stayed at her stove and kept her patience, which was the hardest thing she did all day and the thing she was most practiced at. The drive came back on a Friday, which was not when it was expected. Grayson had pushed the men harder than the original schedule, cutting 2 days off the return leg because the cattle had moved well, and he'd seen no reason to hold back once they were past the worst of the open terrain. The first sign Rowan had of their return was the sound, "Cattle are not quiet, and 22 men with horses and equipment are not quiet," and the sound reached the estate a good 20 minutes before the dust did. She had extra food ready by the time they arrived, not because she'd known, she hadn't, but because she always cooked more than she expected to need. It was a habit from the logging camp days, where men showed up late and hungry, and you either had food or you had a problem. Grayson came through the kitchen door before he'd even been to his own room. He was dirty, trail-worn, with several days of beard, and the particular flatness in his eyes that came from sustained hard work without adequate sleep. He looked around the kitchen. She had scrubbed it top to bottom the previous 2 days, the shelves ordered and labeled, the cellar fully restocked, the stove burning clean and even. And then he looked at her. "You got my letters," he said. "I did. All of them. Every one." He pulled out the chair at the end of the preparation table and sat down in it heavily. Not on the table this time. In the chair, which she had come to understand meant he was more tired than usual. "Heller came here." "He did." "What did you say to him?" She told him precisely what she had said. She was not the kind of person who summarized her own conversations in ways that made herself look better than the reality. She gave him the actual words as close as she could remember them, including Heller's comment about relationships in a small place. Grayson was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he said, "And Briggs." "That's a longer conversation," she said. "Are you hungry?" He looked at her as if the question were slightly absurd given everything else happening. Then, yes, she put food in front of him. He ate without ceremony while she told him what she had found in the supply ledger, Briggs's handwriting on the order records, the consistency of Heller's overcharging across 3 years, the likely connection between the two. She put her notebook on the table beside his plate and let him look at it while he ate, because she had found that men absorb difficult information better when their hands were occupied. He read through the relevant pages. He ate. He didn't interrupt. When he was finished eating, he pushed the plate aside and looked at the notebook for a moment longer. "You're certain about the handwriting?" "I compared it against the work orders Briggs signs off on for the barn inventory. It's the same." "That doesn't prove a formal arrangement with Heller." "No," she said. "It proves Briggs was managing the orders and didn't object to Heller's pricing for 3 years. Whatever the reason for that is, you can draw your own conclusions." Grayson closed the notebook and looked at her. "What do you want me to do with this?" It was not the question she'd expected. She'd expected him to tell her what he was going to do. That he was asking her told her something about how his thinking had shifted in the 2 months he'd been gone. "Talk to Briggs," she said. "Privately first. See what he says. If he lies about the ordering records when you have the ledger in front of him, you have your answer." He nodded slowly. "All right." He stood up, picking up his hat from the table. "I'll do it tonight." "Tomorrow," she said. "You've been on the trail for 6 weeks. Do it when you're rested." He paused. Something in his face shifted. Not the held-back surprise this time. Something different. Something that didn't have a quick name. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He spoke to Briggs the next morning in his study, with the ledger on the desk between them. Rowan was not in the room. She didn't need to be. She was in the kitchen, close enough to hear the tone through the walls without hearing the words, which was enough. Raised voices on one side, lower and steadier on the other, then quiet for a long time. Then nothing. At 10 o'clock, Grayson assembled every man on the property in the yard outside the bunkhouse. Rowan stood on the kitchen porch, watching through the doorway. She did not go out. This was not her moment to stand in, and she understood that. He was not loud about it. That was the thing she remembered afterward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make it theatrical. He stood in front of his men, most of whom had just come off a hard 6-week drive, and he told them plainly that Briggs was leaving the estate, that he had been involved in an arrangement that cost Ironwood money over a period of years, that anyone who felt they couldn't work in an environment where the kitchen was managed as it currently was managed was free to collect their wages and go. Nobody moved. Not one man walked out. Briggs packed his things in 20 minutes. He didn't look at Rowan when he left. He walked past the kitchen porch with his bag over his shoulder and his jaw set in the direction of the road, and she watched him go without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said for her. Hector came to the kitchen door that afternoon as she was starting supper. "That was a long time coming," he said. She said. "Briggs has been running that supply arrangement since before Dell, before Haas." He leaned against the door frame. "Some of us knew something was off, didn't know the particulars." "Why didn't anyone say anything?" Hector was quiet for a moment. "Briggs had been here a long time, and the supplies still came. Things still worked." He shrugged. "Sometimes you don't say something because you don't know exactly what you'd be saying." She understood that. It wasn't admirable, but it was human. "The food's going to be good tonight," she told him. "Go clean up." He did. What Rowan had not fully prepared for was how the removal of Briggs changed the atmosphere of the estate so quickly and so completely. It wasn't that everything became easy. Nothing on a working ranch became easy, and there were still men who weren't sure what to make of her. And there were still days when the stove ran wrong, or the delivery was late, or 3 men came in with cuts and bruises from a fencing incident, and she had to clean wounds as well as cook, because there was nobody else immediately available. She was not the kind of person who confused the removal of a problem with the arrival of a solution. But the particular tension that had been present since her first morning, the undercurrent of organized resistance, the small daily sabotages, that was gone. And in its place was something she hadn't expected. Men started talking to her. Not about the food, not about requests or complaints, but just talking. Hector told her about his wife in San Antonio, who was ill and whom he sent money to every month. A younger hand named Pierce told her he'd been trying to learn to read and asked if she had any books, which she didn't. but she wrote him a letter to the school teacher in town and told him to ask about evening sessions. Curtis, who had been carefully neutral since her arrival, started having his morning coffee in the kitchen instead of the bunkhouse. None of this was lost on Grayson. He was in the kitchen more than he used to be. Part of it was practical. The financial review he'd done on returning from the drive had confirmed everything Rowan had put in her notebooks, and there were follow-up conversations to have about future supply arrangements and the upcoming season. But some of it was something else. He ate supper at the long table with the men most evenings, the way he always had, but he stayed afterwards sometimes, sitting at the end of the preparation table with a cup of coffee while she cleaned up, not demanding conversation but not leaving either. She found she didn't mind it. She was not a person who found silence uncomfortable, and he was not a person who filled silence with noise. They could exist in the same room with a task going on, and it didn't feel like a strain. One evening he said, out of nowhere, "What was your husband like?" She paused in what she was doing. Not a long pause. She'd had 8 months of practice at not making the mention of Daniel into a moment, but a pause. "Stubborn," she said. "More stubborn than me, which is saying something. He believed in things very hard. Sometimes the right things, sometimes the wrong things. He wasn't good at asking for help." "Did he know what you were capable of?" Grayson said. She thought about that honestly. "Partly," she said. "He saw some of it. Not all of it." She went back to wiping the table. "He was a good man, just not always good at seeing past what he expected to see." Grayson was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair way to put it." "It took me a while to get there," she said. "The fair version of things usually takes time." She didn't ask him about his own history. She had gathered fragments. There had been a wife, years ago, before the estate was what it was now, who had not stayed. Nobody told her this directly, but it was in the edges of things. The way the ranch house was furnished for function rather than comfort. The way he ate with the men rather than alone in a house with too many empty rooms. She didn't ask because he hadn't offered, and she had learned that some information was offered when people were ready and not before. It was the third week after the drive's return when Heller made his second move. She had known it was coming. She had told herself it was coming. Knowing something is coming and being fully ready for it are different things, and she was honest with herself about that. The first sign was a rider from the bank. He came on a Wednesday morning, a young man, well-dressed, uncomfortable on horseback, in a way that told you he was office-bred, and he asked to see Mr. Hawthorne directly. Curtis brought him to the study. Rowan was not invited and didn't expect to be. She learned what had happened from Grayson afterward, at the end of the day, when he came to the kitchen with a different kind of tiredness on him. Not trail tiredness, the other kind. "Heller went to the bank," Grayson said. She waited. Specifically, to a man named Prescott at the Merritt County Savings and Lending. Prescott holds the note on the North Pasture land, the expansion from 4 years ago. He sat down. Heller told Prescott that the estate's finances were being mismanaged, that the supply arrangements had been restructured in ways that cut established vendors out and created risk, that the kitchen operation was under the management of someone with a history of financial irregularities. The last phrase landed between them. "He used Walter's story," Rowan said. "He used something." Prescott was concerned enough to send that rider. Grayson rubbed the back of his neck. "Prescott wants a meeting. Financial review. Within 2 weeks." Rowan was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the notebook, about the supply records, about the comparison between what Heller had charged Ironwood for 3 years and what she had spent in the 2 months since. She was also thinking about something harder, which was that Heller had found the one piece of her history that could be made to look damaging without context, and he had used it, and she had known this was possible and had told herself she was ready for it. "He's going after your lending relationship," she said. "If Prescott calls the note, you'd have to liquidate something to cover it." "I know what he's doing," Grayson said, a little more sharply than usual. Then, "I'm sorry, I know you know that." She let it go. "What does the drive profit look like?" "Good. Best in 3 years." "And the estate accounts overall, with the new supply arrangements?" "Better than they were." "Then we give Prescott what he's asking for." She stood up straighter. "Not just what he's asking for. Everything, every number from the last 6 months versus the same 6 months of the previous year. The supply savings itemized, The kitchen expenditures versus yield, the drive profits, all of it, in one document, clear enough that a man who doesn't know ranching can follow it. Grayson looked at her. That's a week of work. Then we start tonight. He stared at her for a long moment. Rowan. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noted it. The meeting with Prescott is in 2 weeks, she said. That's enough time if we don't waste it. He got up from the table. He went to his study, and she finished what needed doing in the kitchen, told Edith she'd be up late, and went to join him. They worked for 6 evenings across 10 days. It was not a comfortable process. Grayson had records that were thorough, but organized in a way that made sense to him and not necessarily to an outside reader, and Rowan spent the better part of the first 2 evenings just understanding his system before she could begin integrating it with her own kitchen records. There were gaps, years where the logging was incomplete, periods where Curtis had kept accounts and done it less carefully than Grayson would have, and they had to decide what to present and how to present it without misrepresenting the gaps. We don't hide anything, Rowan said, on the 3rd evening when Grayson seemed inclined to simply leave out a quarter from 2 years ago where the numbers were unimpressive. It weakens the overall picture. 1 weak quarter in a presentation of the last 5 years doesn't weaken the picture. It makes the picture credible. Prescott is a banker. He knows what ranch operations look like. If everything we show him is perfect, he'll know we've cherry-picked. Grayson looked at the quarter in question. Fine, he said, though not happily. She noted, without saying anything, that this was the thing Grayson was not best at, accepting the strategic value of showing weakness. He was good at most things. He was good at running men and reading cattle and making decisions under pressure. But the idea of walking into a room with someone who had been told his finances were mismanaged and showing that person anything less than the strongest possible numbers made him tense in a way she could see in his shoulders. On the 4th evening, she said, "You've been doing this alone a long time." He didn't look up from the ledger he was cross-referencing. "What makes you say that?" "The way you fight me when I suggest showing something unflattering," she said. "It's not that you don't trust my judgment, it's that you're used to being the only one whose judgment is on the line when something goes wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a problem?" "It's a habit," she said. "Habits can change." He looked at her then. The lamp between them made the room small and warm, and the shadows long, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't quite have a name for yet. "You're not afraid of much," he said. "I'm afraid of plenty," she said. "I'm afraid Prescott will listen to Heller's version over our numbers. I'm afraid that if this estate loses the North Pasture loan, you'll have to make cuts that hurt good men. I'm afraid my mother's hip is getting worse, and I don't know how to help it." She looked back at the papers. "I just don't see what good being afraid does if you still have to do the work." He was quiet after that, and they worked another hour without talking, and it was one of the more honest hours she had spent with another person in a long time. On the 9th day, with the meeting set for the following morning, Rowan was alone in the kitchen at 11 at night, finishing the final summary document. She had a clear hand. Years of record-keeping had made her writing precise, and she was copying the final figures into a clean version when she heard footsteps in the yard. She didn't think much of it. Men moved around at night on a working ranch, but the footsteps stopped outside the kitchen door, and then the door opened, and it was Vic Lander. Lander was one of the newer hands. He had come on just before the drive, one of the 4 additional men Grayson had taken on. He was younger than most of the others, somewhere in his mid-20s, and he had kept to himself in a way that Rowan had read as shyness, but now, standing in her kitchen doorway at 11 at night, she was reading differently. "Lander," she said. She kept her voice even. "Kitchen's closed." "I know." He stepped inside. He wasn't drunk. She could see that, which in some ways made it worse. He was deliberate. "I just wanted to talk to you. It's late." "I know it is." He moved closer to the preparation table. She was on the other side of it, and she was aware of the positions in the room. Him near the door, her with the stove behind her and the table between them. Her skillet was on its hook to her left. "I've been thinking," Lander said, "that you've got a lot of pull around here for someone who just cooks." "I cook," she said. "Among other things." "Briggs said you were going to be trouble." He wasn't being aggressive exactly. His tone was conversational almost, which was its own kind of disturbing. I think maybe he was right. I think you should go back to the bunkhouse, she said. I think you're used to telling people what to do, Lander said, and now his voice had something harder in it. And I think that works on some folks. But there are men here who remember what this place was like before you showed up and complicated everything. Before I saved this estate thousands of dollars, she said. Before you started making men feel like they were being watched, like things were going to change on them. He took one more step toward the table. It's not comfortable. Rowan reached up and took the skillet off its hook. Not raising it, just holding it, the way you hold a thing that has weight and that you have held so many times that the balance of it is part of your hand. Lander looked at the skillet, then at her. You going to hit me with a pan? He said, with a disbelief that told her he thought this was almost funny. I'm going to tell you, she said, that I have been in this kitchen since 3 this morning. I have cooked 3 meals for 21 men. I have spent 5 hours on financial documents for a meeting that will determine whether this estate keeps its north pasture, and I have exactly no patience left for men who come into my kitchen in the dark to make me feel uncertain about my place here. She looked at him directly. My place here is not uncertain. Now get out. Lander stared at her. She didn't move. She didn't look away. She had her grandmother's skillet in her hand and 17 years of hard work behind her, and she was not going to be moved by a 25-year-old with a problem. The door opened behind him. Grayson was there. He had clearly been heading back from his study. He had papers under one arm, his lamp in the other hand, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at Lander, then at Rowan, then at the skillet, and understood the situation with the speed of a man who had been reading rooms for a long time. Lander, he said quietly. Mr. Hawthorne, go to the bunkhouse. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Lander went. Grayson stepped into the kitchen and set his lamp on the table. He looked at Rowan. She still had the skillet in her hand. She became aware of this and hung it back on the hook. Are you all right? He said. Yes. She looked at the document she'd been writing, which was still on the table, undamaged, ink dry. He didn't touch anything. Rowan, she looked up. Are you all right? He said again, slower. She understood what he was actually asking, not whether anything had happened, whether she was her. I'm tired, she said, and angry, and I need 20 more minutes to finish this document. She met his eyes. I'm all right. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table, her side of the table, close, and sat down. I'll stay while you finish, he said. She thought about arguing. She decided not to. She sat back down and picked up her pen and finished the document with Grayson Hawthorne sitting at the other end of the table reading his papers, the 2 lamps making the kitchen warm and small against the dark outside, and neither of them saying anything because nothing needed to be said. The meeting with Prescott happened at the county seat the following morning. Rowan did not go. It had been discussed briefly, and she had been the one to say she shouldn't. He came to talk to you, she told Grayson. I go in the room and it becomes a different conversation. It becomes about me and Walter's accusations and Heller's version of things. You take the numbers are what matter. Grayson had looked at her as if he wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He took the documents. He took Curtis, who had been with the estate for 15 years and whose presence would mean something to a county banker. And he drove to the meeting while Rowan cooked breakfast for 21 men and told herself that she had done everything she could do and that the rest was not in her hands. She cleaned the kitchen when breakfast was done. She checked on the root garden, which had produced its first significant yield, beans mostly, and some early squash, and she harvested what was ready. She started the midday meal. She talked to Edith, who was sitting on her stool near the garden and who looked at her daughter's face and said nothing, which was the correct thing. Lander was not at breakfast. He was not at the midday meal either. She heard from Pierce, the young man who had been trying to learn to read, that Lander had taken his things before dawn and left. She was not surprised. Men like Lander didn't stay when the thing they came to do hadn't worked. Grayson came back in the early evening, in time for supper. She was serving when he came in through the back door. He didn't say anything, just washed up at the pump outside and came to the table with the other men and ate, which told her nothing except that he was functional, which was not sufficient information. She waited until the men had cleared out. Well, she said. He sat for a moment with his coffee cup in his hands. Prescott looked at the numbers. Took about 40 minutes. He paused. He said the estate's financials are the strongest he's seen them in 4 years. He confirmed the note on the north pasture, said he wished more of his accounts were run this way. She let out a breath she had been holding for 10 days. He also said, Grayson continued, that Heller had come to him with a very different story and that the documented evidence made Heller's version not credible. He looked up from his coffee. He said, and this is his word, not mine, he said whoever was managing the operations here clearly knew what they were doing. That's good, she said. Yes, Grayson said. It is. He looked at her across the table. Supper was done, the kitchen was hers again, the lamps were burning low, and outside the Texas evening was doing what it did, cooling slowly, with the sound of insects and horses and the particular deep quiet of land that went a long way in all directions. Thank you, he said. It was simply said. No performance in it. You would have gotten there without me, she said, because it was important to be accurate. Maybe, he said, but not like this, not this fast, not this clean. He set his coffee cup down. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I want you to know that I mean it. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with those pale gray eyes that she had learned over 2.5 months were not cold, had never been cold, but rather extremely careful. A man who had been careful for so long he had almost forgotten that care and distance were not the same thing. I know, she said. I know you mean it. She began clearing the supper dishes, and he stayed for a while the way he'd been staying lately, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening, because the day had been long and some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. But Heller was not finished. She didn't know this yet. She was allowing herself, carefully, the relief of the evening. She had earned it. What she didn't know was that Heller, having failed with Prescott, had turned his attention to the one thing she hadn't thought to protect against. Not the estate's finances, not her reputation, but Grayson's standing among the other major landowners in the county. The men whose opinions shaped what was possible on the frontier, who controlled water rights and grazing agreements, and whose word, collectively, was its own kind of currency. Heller had been talking to those men for weeks, and some of them had been listening. That reckoning was still coming, but for now the kitchen was clean, the accounts were sound, and Rowan Mercer was still standing exactly where she had decided to stand. That was enough. For tonight, it was enough. She found out about the landowner meetings from Alderman. He came with his Thursday delivery, eggs, corn, the usual. And he was quieter than usual while Curtis helped unload the wagon. Rowan noticed it the way she noticed most things, not by staring, but by filing it away while she did something else. When Curtis went back to the barn, she poured Alderman a cup of coffee without asking and set it on the edge of the kitchen porch. He took it. He didn't drink it immediately. He turned the cup in his hands. There's talk, he said, about Ironwood, about Hawthorne. He glanced toward the main house, then back at her. Heller's been at the Cattlemen's Association meetings, 2 of them in the last 3 weeks, talking about how this estate is being run and who's running it. Rowan leaned against the porch post. What's he saying? That Hawthorne's judgment has slipped, that he let a woman with a bad history take over his operation, and it's going to cost him. Alderman finally drank some of the coffee. He's been specific about the history, the accusations from Decatur. He's making it sound like there was a legal finding. There wasn't, but he's not saying there wasn't. He's just using words that make people assume. She understood exactly what that meant. She had lived through the technique once before. Who's listening? She said. Some. Not all. He set the cup down. There are men in that association who've done business with Heller a long time, and there are men who don't know Hawthorne well enough to know whether the story makes sense. He paused. Ranchers talk about grazing agreements and water rights, and they vote on things as a body. If enough of them decide Ironwood is a liability, there are arrangements Hawthorne depends on that could be renegotiated. Or not renewed. She was quiet for a moment. When's the next meeting? 2 weeks. There's a vote on the Southern Water Access renewal. Hawthorne's always had a voice in that. If the association turns on him, he loses leverage on the water agreement, she said. Alderman nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. He was not the kind of man who overdid a warning. Thank you, she said. I like doing business here, he said simply. I'd like to keep doing it. He got back on his wagon. She stood on the porch until he was out of the yard. then went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment, thinking. This was different from Prescott. Prescott had been about numbers. She was good with numbers. She could make numbers speak. The Cattlemen's Association was about relationships and reputation and the accumulated weight of who knew who and how long they'd known them. Grayson had history with those men going back years, in some cases decades. She had nothing in that room. She was a widow from somewhere else with accusations against her name, and there was no financial document she could produce that would walk into a meeting and speak for itself. She needed a different approach entirely. Sermon. She told Grayson that evening. He took it with the particular stillness she had come to recognize as the way he absorbed bad news. Not deflecting, not denying, just sitting with it until he had decided what he thought. Heller's been at the association, he said finally. 2 meetings. Who told you? Alderman. He nodded once. He trusted aldermen. She knew this because she had made a point of understanding which people Grayson trusted and why. The water agreement is in 2 weeks, he said. I know. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the trail tiredness or the end-of-the-day tiredness, but something deeper. Heller's not a man who can be outspent or outlawyered easily, he said. He's been in this county a long time. He has friends. He has people who owe him favors, she said. That's not the same as friends. In practical terms, it functions the same way. In practical terms, yes. But in a room of men who are deciding whether to trust him or trust you, it matters. She looked at him. Who in that association actually likes Heller? Not owes him, not depends on him, likes him. Grayson thought about it honestly. Not many, he said. He's useful. He's not liked. And you? He looked at her, uncertain where she was going. Are you liked? She said. Not respected, not depended on, actually liked. Who in that room would sit with you at the end of a long day and call you a friend? He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer. Grayson Hawthorne was respected. He was considered fair. He was the kind of man that other men called on in a dispute because he gave honest assessments. But he was, as she had suspected, somewhat isolated in the way that men who spent too much time running things and not enough time being in the company of other people tended to be. Rourke, he said, finally. Tom Rourke, who runs the Double Fork spread to the north. And maybe Caldwell. Elias Caldwell, if he hasn't been got to yet. Then those are the men we need to talk to before the meeting, she said. Not at the meeting, before it. Rowan, I'm not suggesting anything improper, she said. I'm suggesting you go and have a conversation with the men who already believe you're a fair person, and you tell them what actually happened with Heller, with the supply arrangements, with Prescott. With all of it. You let them hear your version from your mouth, not Heller's version filtered through 2 weeks of association gossip. She paused. You bring the same documents we showed Prescott. Grayson looked at the table for a moment. You think that's enough? I think it's what we have, she said. Heller's had 2 meetings. We have 2 weeks. It's enough time if you move now. He was quiet again. Then, come with me. She looked up. To speak with Rourke and Caldwell. Yes. She hadn't expected that. They don't know me. No, he said. But they'll form an opinion of you within 10 minutes, and whatever that opinion is, it'll be based on you, not on what Heller's been saying. He met her eyes. You're the one who built the case. You know the numbers better than I do, and if they're going to hear my version of what happened at this estate, they should also see the person who actually made it happen. She thought about what that meant. Walking into a room with 2 powerful ranchers who had heard, through association gossip, that she was a woman of questionable history and simply being herself in front of them. No defense, no explanation, just presence. She had done harder things. All right, she said. When do we go? Tomorrow, he said. Rourke first. Tom Rourke's ranch was 18 miles north, and they drove out in Grayson's wagon early in the morning before the day got hot. Edith had made a comment over breakfast when she heard they were going together, a small comment that managed to contain about 4 different meanings simultaneously. But Rowan had decided to let it go because her mother's commentary on anything other than the practical matter at hand was not what she needed at 7 in the morning. Rourke was a broad, red-faced man with an enormous gray mustache, and the manner of someone who had made up his mind about most things 20 years ago and was not particularly interested in revising. He came out to the yard when they arrived and shook Grayson's hand with the genuine warmth of a man who actually meant it, which told Rowan immediately that Grayson had been right about him. He looked at Rowan with frank curiosity, but without hostility. "This is Mrs. Mercer," Grayson said. "She manages the kitchen operations at Ironwood." "Heard about you," Rourke said. "I expect you have," Rowan said. He seemed to appreciate the directness. "Come inside, coffee's on." They sat in Rourke's kitchen, a large, well-worn room that smelled of a morning's cooking, and Grayson explained the situation. He was honest about it in a way Rowan hadn't heard him be with anyone outside the two of them. He told Rourke about the supply arrangement with Heller, about what the ledgers had shown, about Briggs, about the meeting with Prescott, and what the bank had concluded. He talked for 20 minutes without embellishment and without minimizing the difficult parts. Rourke listened. He poured more coffee. He didn't interrupt. When Grayson finished, Rourke looked at Rowan. "And you figured all this out?" "I keep records," she said, "and I was new, so I had no reason not to question existing arrangements. People who've been somewhere a long time stop seeing what's in front of them. That's not a flaw. It's just how familiarity works." Rourke considered that. "Heller said you had legal trouble in Decatur. My brother-in-law accused me of stealing from the operation my husband left behind. He wanted the business. He said what he needed to say to get it." She held Rourke's gaze. "No charges were filed. No court found anything. He made accusations in a small town to people who were inclined to believe him, and I left rather than spend years fighting in a place that had already decided." She paused. "I'm not particularly interested in telling people what to think of me. The work at Ironwood is a matter of record." Rourke looked at Grayson. "She always like this?" "Always," Grayson said, and there was something in how he said it that Rourke noticed and filed away and chose not to remark on. "Heller's going to push for the water vote," Rourke said, returning to the matter. "He's got Danforth and probably Marsh on his side. That's 2 votes before anyone opens their mouth." "Who else is persuadable?" Grayson said. "Elias Caldwell. He's been quiet. That usually means he hasn't decided yet." Rourke stroked his mustache. "If you go see Caldwell today, and if you bring those documents, the bank letter from Prescott especially, you might have him." He looked at Rowan again. "Caldwell's wife lost her first husband young. He has a particular view of women managing their own affairs. Might go in your favor." "I'm not looking for his sympathy," Rowan said. "No," Rourke said, "but you'll take his vote." She had to concede that. Elias Caldwell was quieter than Rourke and harder to read. He was a lean, deliberate man in his late 50s who ran a smaller spread than either Ironwood or Double Fork, but who Rourke had told them carried more influence than his acreage suggested, because he had been in the county the longest and people trusted his assessments. He did not say much during Grayson's explanation. He read the documents thoroughly, more thoroughly than Rourke had, going back to re-examine individual figures, and when he was done, he set them on the table and folded his hands. "Heller told us the estate's finances had been destabilized," he said. "These numbers suggest the opposite." "The numbers are accurate," Grayson said. "You can verify them with Prescott directly." "I might." He looked at Rowan. "And you've been managing this operation since when?" "I arrived in late spring. About 4 months now." 4 months. He seemed to be calculating something. "Heller's been supplying Ironwood for 6 years, and you cut him out in 4 months." "I found more competitive suppliers," she said. "The cost savings are in the documents." "I see them." He was quiet for a moment. "Heller's not going to let this go easily." "I know," Rowan said. "He'll try again at the meeting. Even if Rourke and I vote with Hawthorne on the water agreement, Heller will use the floor to make his case to the other men. Try to create doubt." He looked at her directly. "What are you going to do about that?" She had been thinking about this since the night Alderman came with the warning. "He can say whatever he wants at the meeting," she said. "What I'm going to do is make sure that before those men vote, they have access to the same information Prescott had. I can't walk into that room, but the numbers can." Caldwell looked at Grayson. "She's suggesting we distribute the financial summary before the meeting." "That's right," Grayson said. "You're comfortable with other ranchers seeing your estate's detailed financials." I'm comfortable with them seeing the truth, Grayson said. I'd rather have no secrets and a good reputation than the alternative. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. I'll speak to a few men before the meeting, and I'll take a copy of those documents. Oh, the 2 weeks before the association meeting were some of the longest of Rowan's life. Not because she had nothing to do, but because she had done everything she could do and still had time left over in which to worry. She ran the kitchen. She managed the accounts. The root garden yielded a second significant harvest, and she put up preserves for the first time in 2 years, using the kitchen's largest pots and Edith's memory for the process, because Edith had put up preserves every year of her adult life and knew things about it that Rowan had half forgotten. Peaches next, Edith said, sitting at the kitchen table watching Rowan work. Alderman said his wife has a tree. I'll ask him. Don't ask. Tell him you're buying. Asking makes it sound optional. I know how to buy peaches, Mama. You know how to run a cattle estate, apparently, Edith said. Peaches are different. Despite herself, Rowan laughed. It was a short laugh, and it surprised her. She hadn't laughed in a while, she realized. Weeks, at least. Edith heard it and looked pleased with herself, which was typical. The other thing that happened in those 2 weeks was smaller, but in the long run, larger. Grayson had taken to eating breakfast in the kitchen on Sundays, which was a lighter morning because the men ate later and the pace was different. He sat at the end of the preparation table with coffee and whatever she was making, and he went over the week's accounts or read correspondence, and she worked, and it was the same comfortable quiet they'd built up in the late evenings over the financial documents. Except that Sunday mornings were not late and urgent. They were early and easy, and the light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, and there was no crisis attached to them. On the second Sunday before the meeting, he said, Edith's hip is worse. Rowan's hand stilled for a moment. You noticed that? I notice things, he said, and said it without emphasis, which was more effective than if he'd tried to make it significant. Is there a doctor in Merritt she hasn't seen? She saw the doctor in Caldwell. He said there isn't much to be done for it. It's the joint, not the bone. There's a man in San Antonio, Grayson said. I've heard of him. He does things with joints that the county doctors don't know how to do. He looked at his coffee. After the meeting, if things go right. I'd like to arrange for her to see him. Rowan looked at him. Grayson. It's not charity, he said, a little more quickly than was quite casual. Edith keeps your mind at ease. Your mind being at ease is beneficial to the operation of this estate. It's a rational business decision. She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at his coffee with great attention. Thank you, she said. It's a rational business decision, he said again. I heard you, she said, and turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something in the room had shifted the way rooms shift when the thing that hasn't been said has been almost said, and both people know it. The Cattlemen's Association meeting was held at the county seat, in a long building that served as a meeting hall. Grayson went. Rowan did not. She had sent the documents with him, 2 full copies, one for Rourke and one for Caldwell to distribute at their discretion. She had also, at the last moment, added a 1-page summary in plain language that laid out the comparison between the estate's finances under the old supply arrangement and the new one, written clearly enough that a man who didn't know ranching could follow it in 3 minutes. Grayson had looked at it the night before and said, This is very clear. That's the point, she said. He had taken it without further comment. She spent the day of the meeting doing the things she always did, because doing what she always did was the only way she knew to keep anxiety from making her useless. She made breakfast. She organized the week's supply list. She harvested the last of the summer squash from the root garden, which had produced beyond anything she'd expected from a neglected plot in its first real season. She sat with Edith in the afternoon and let her mother talk about whatever she wanted to talk about, which was how Rowan had always known her mother was a wise woman. She knew when to simply be present. Curtis came back from the county seat before Grayson, because Curtis drove separately and left when the public portion of the meeting was over. He came into the kitchen, which told her it was important. Well, she said. Heller spoke for about 20 minutes, Curtis said. He sat down, which was unusual for him. He had some of the men going at first. He's good at talking. I know. Caldwell interrupted him, asked him directly whether he was aware of the financial records that had been submitted to Prescott at the county bank. Heller said the records were incomplete or manipulated. He stopped short of saying falsified, but he came close. Curtis looked at her. Then Rourke said that he had reviewed the same records and found them to be consistent with everything Hawthorne had maintained for years, and that furthermore, Prescott had renewed the note on the north pasture, which a banker does not do for an operation that is being mismanaged. And Caldwell said that he had spoken personally with two of the new suppliers, including Alderman, and verified the pricing, and that the savings to the estate were exactly what the records indicated. Rowan let out a slow breath. Heller tried to keep going, Curtis said. But when two of the most senior men in the room have contradicted you with specific evidence and named their sources, it's hard to keep going. He said some things about the irregularity of having a woman manage a major estate operation. Curtis paused. Caldwell said that in his experience, irregular was another word for effective, and then they voted. The water agreement. Renewed, majority vote, Ironwood included. Heller was on the losing side. She stood very still for a moment. He's not going to stop, she said. Men like him don't stop after one loss. No, Curtis said, but he's going to have to find new arguments. The ones he had didn't work. She nodded. Curtis left. She turned back to the stove and stood there with her hands on the edge of it, not for support, but because the iron was warm and solid, and she needed something warm and solid for a moment. Grayson came home at dusk. He came in through the kitchen door, which had become his way of coming home, and he looked at her and said nothing for a moment. The kitchen smelled of the supper that was already done and being kept warm, and the light was low and yellow, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. You already know, he said. Curtis told me the main points. He nodded. He came in and sat down, and she put supper in front of him because he hadn't eaten since morning, and she knew this about him. He ate for a few minutes in silence. Caldwell said something at the end, Grayson said, after the vote. To me, privately. She waited. He said, whatever you're paying the woman, it isn't enough. She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. I told him, Grayson said, that he was probably right. 3 days after the meeting, Fletcher Heller's operation ran into trouble of its own making. Rowan heard about it from two sources simultaneously, Alderman on his Thursday delivery, and a rider who came through on separate business. The story was the same from both directions, which meant it was probably true. Heller had been overcharging multiple operations across Merritt County, not just Ironwood. The pattern Rowan had identified in the Ironwood ledgers was apparently consistent with how Heller did business generally. What had happened was that after the association meeting, where two senior ranchers had publicly discussed the pricing comparison in specific terms, other ranchers had gone home and looked at their own accounts, and they had found the same discrepancies. By the end of the week, 3 operations had severed their supply arrangements with Heller. By the following week, 2 more. Heller did not have the financial cushion to absorb that kind of loss simultaneously, and the word that came through Alderman on the next Thursday delivery was that Heller was having conversations with his own lenders that were not going particularly well. He did not come back to Ironwood. He did not send a rider, did not write a letter, did not appear at the next association meeting, which Grayson attended without incident. The Southern Water Access Agreement held. The estate's accounts, going into fall, were the strongest they had been in years. The second cattle drive was smaller, a routine move to winter grazing, and it went without difficulty. What Rowan noticed in the weeks after Heller's influence collapsed was the quiet. Not the absence of noise, a working ranch was never truly quiet, but the absence of the particular kind of noise that had followed her since her arrival. The undertow of organized resistance, the sense of something building against her, the way certain conversations stopped when she entered a room. That was gone. In its place was something ordinary, which was exactly what she had been working toward and which she had not quite let herself imagine fully until she had it. Men said good morning to her by name. Pierce had started attending the evening school sessions in town and came to tell her about it with a pride he didn't quite know how to contain. Hector's wife in San Antonio had responded to the money he'd sent with a letter saying she was improving, and he told Rowan this while eating breakfast one morning in a tone that was matter-of-fact and also completely undone at the same time. The estate felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a place that was all one thing rather than a place divided against itself. The conversation with Grayson happened on a Sunday evening in early fall. The day had been cooler than the ones before it, and the evening was cool enough that she had left the kitchen door open for the first time in weeks, without the heat being a problem. She was putting up the last of the fall preserves, pear this time, from a tree at the edge of the property that had produced unexpectedly well. And he came in from the yard and stopped in the doorway the way he did. Except he didn't sit down at the table. He stood there. She kept working. She had learned a long time ago not to rush Grayson Hawthorne. "I want to say something," he said. "And I don't want you to respond to the business part of it first, because you'll do that, and then the other part won't get said." She set down the ladle. She turned to look at him. He was uncomfortable. She had never seen him quite that uncomfortable before, and there was something almost tender about it. This large, capable, careful man who was so practiced at managing everything standing in her kitchen doorway, not entirely sure what to do with his own face. "The estate is what it is," he said. "You know what it's worth. You know the land and the accounts as well as I do at this point, maybe better in some areas. And you have done more for it in 5 months than most people would have done in 2 years." He stopped, tried again. "That's the business part. The other part is that you have been, the person I trust most in my own house, in my own life, at this point. And I've been aware of that for a while, and I've been aware that I've been doing a poor job of saying anything about it." She looked at him. "I'm not talking about gratitude," he said. "I'm past that." "I know," she said. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. It's been a long time since I thought any of this was available to me. I'm not certain I'm not misreading things." "You're not misreading things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No?" "No," she said. "You're about 10 weeks behind where I figured this out, but no." Something in his expression shifted. Something that was partly surprise and partly recognition, and partly, she thought, relief. Deep relief. The kind that comes when a person has been holding something carefully for a very long time. 10 weeks, he said. "At least." He came fully into the kitchen. He stopped close enough that she could see the detail of his expression clearly in the evening light. "I don't want to make assumptions about what you want," he said. "You have your own. You're not a woman who needs—" "Grayson," she said. "Yes." "You're doing the business part again." He stopped. After a moment, something in his face did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, which was let go of the careful. And what was underneath the careful was a face she was not entirely prepared for, open and a little uncertain and completely genuine. "Stay," he said. "Not because of the estate or the accounts or any of it. Just stay." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the road into Ironwood that she had walked in the summer heat with her mother on her arm, and her grandmother's skillet under her elbow, and $43 to her name, and a reputation that had arrived before she did. She thought about the burned pot on the stove, and the open sacks, and the tin cup with the dead fly in it, and the kitchen she had made from all of that. She thought about Daniel, and about the fair version of things taking time, and about the fact that she had not walked down that road running from anything. She had said so at the beginning. She had meant it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was not the most romantic thing that had ever been said in a kitchen. It was, however, the truest thing she could offer, and it was what she meant. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just the way you reach for something you've been circling for a long time. And they stood there in the kitchen that smelled of pear preserves and wood smoke and everything she had built. And outside the Texas evening settled into full dark, slow and enormous, and indifferent to all of it in the way that the land always is and always will be, and none of that mattered at all. Swamped. The fall moved into winter at Ironwood with a steadiness that felt, for the first time, like something built rather than something endured. Edith made the trip to San Antonio in October, accompanied by Curtis and a neighbor woman who had agreed to travel with her. The Dr. Grayson had mentioned turned out to be real and competent, and while he did not promise miracles, no one promised miracles to a 71-year-old woman with a damaged hip joint, he gave her a treatment and a regimen that brought her enough relief that she could walk unaided in the mornings for the first time in 2 years. She came back from San Antonio with a particular expression that Rowan had not seen on her mother's face in a long time. Something that was not quite content but was in the neighborhood of it. "He's a good man," Edith said the evening after she returned. The doctor, Rowan said. Edith gave her a look. You know who I mean. Rowan said nothing. Your father was a difficult man, Edith said. Daniel was a good man with blind spots. That one in there, she nodded toward the main house, is not perfect either, I'm sure. But he sent an old woman to a doctor without being asked, and he organized the travel, and he paid for it without making it into a thing. She settled back in her chair. That's character. Character doesn't change. I know, Rowan said. I know you know, Edith said. I just like saying it. The winter supply arrangements were the most organized the estate had ever had. Rowan knew this because she had the previous year's records to compare against, and the comparison was not subtle. She had found 2 additional suppliers through the fall, had renegotiated the arrangement with the man who brought their salt and dried goods, and had spent a week in September reorganizing the smokehouse in a way that extended the life of the preserved meat by 3 weeks. 3 weeks of preserved meat on a 40-man operation was not a small number. She put all of it in the accounts. She always put everything in the accounts. One evening, late in November, she found Grayson sitting with her notebook. The original one, the one she'd kept from the beginning, with Briggs's handwriting comparison and the Heller pricing and all the rest. That's mine, she said. I know, I'm reading it. She sat across from him. He read for another few minutes, then he set it down. You started documenting things immediately, he said. First week. Because of what happened in Decatur. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Whoever Walter is, he said carefully, I'd like to meet him. You'd hate him, she said. Yes, Grayson said. That's what I mean. She looked at him, and this time when she felt the thing in her chest that had no quick name, she let herself feel it because there was no crisis attached to the evening, and her work was sound and her mother was sleeping better than she had in 2 years, and outside the Texas winter was settling in clean and cold over the best-run estate in Merritt County, and the man sitting across from her was looking at her with that open expression she had not been prepared for and was becoming, slowly, accustomed to. Things were not perfect. They would not become perfect. The land didn't care, the weather didn't care. And there would be hard seasons and difficult men and problems she couldn't document her way out of. But tonight the kitchen was warm and the accounts were balanced, and she was exactly where she had decided to be. That was the thing about staying. You had to decide it every day. And she had. They were married in the spring, quietly, the way both of them wanted, not because they were ashamed of it or uncertain about it, but because neither of them was the kind of person who needed a thing witnessed by 100 people to believe it was real. Grayson had asked her in the kitchen, not on one knee, not with performance, just standing near the window one morning in January while the coffee was still brewing, saying her name in a way that meant he'd been thinking about how to say what came next for some time. I want to marry you, he said, not because of the estate, not because of any practical reason, because I want to. He paused. I know I'm not saying it in a way that, yes, she said. He stopped. I wasn't finished. I know, but the answer is yes, and you can finish if you want to. He looked at her for a moment. Yes? Yes. He had exhaled slowly, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and she had found it unexpectedly moving. This man who held everything together, briefly not holding anything together, just breathing. The ceremony itself was small. Tom Rourke and his wife came. Elias Caldwell came with his daughter. Curtis stood at Grayson's side because there was nobody who had been longer at Ironwood or more deserving of the position. Edith sat in the front with the particular expression of a woman who had been worried about her daughter for a long time and had decided cautiously to stop. Alderman came with his wife, who brought flowers from her garden that nobody had asked for and that made the room look better than anything planned would have. Hector stood in the back. When it was over and people were talking, Rowan caught his eye across the room. He nodded once, the same way he had nodded at her on the first morning over breakfast, over soft bacon he hadn't complained about since. She nodded back. The wedding supper afterward was cooked by the wives of 2 neighboring ranchers who had insisted on contributing and whom Rowan had let, because she had also learned over the past year that letting people help was its own kind of intelligence. She sat at the table in her own kitchen and ate food cooked by other people, and let that be fine. It was fine. What changed after the wedding was less about the estate and more about how people outside the estate treated her, which she had not anticipated and which she found, when she thought about it honestly, both simpler and more complicated than she'd expected. She was on paper the wife of one of the wealthiest cattle barons in Merritt County. That changed certain conversations. Men who had been politely neutral about her for the better part of a year suddenly became enthusiastic in their regard, which told her precisely what she needed to know about the quality of that regard. Women who had kept their distance began calling, leaving cards, issuing invitations to the sort of county social occasions that Rowan had never had occasion to attend, because she had been, for most of her life, too poor or too precarious to be invited. She attended some of these. She wore clothes that she had not owned a year ago and sat in rooms with women who were deciding what to make of her, and she was polite and direct and genuine. And she did not perform any version of herself that was different from the version that had walked into Ironwood Estate with a skillet under her arm. Some of them liked her for it. A few of them did not. That was the same ratio she had always worked with, and she saw no reason why money should change it. The one she liked best, unexpectedly, was Rourke's wife, Clara. Clara Rourke was 50 years old and had run Double Fork's household accounts for 25 of those years, and had strong opinions about everything and did not bother softening them for company. She came to Ironwood one afternoon in April with no advance notice, which Rowan privately respected, and sat in the kitchen while Rowan was working and talked to her as though they had been friends for years. "You're not what people expected," Clara said, watching Rowan salt a pot. "What did they expect? Someone softer or someone harder? People are always expecting one or the other from a woman who comes from nothing and ends up with something." She helped herself to the coffee on the stove, which she had not been offered. Rowan noted this and liked her more for it. "You're neither." "I'm just working," Rowan said. "That's what I mean," Clara said. "Most women in your position would spend the next 5 years recovering from the effort of getting here. Lying down, essentially." "Lying down sounds nice," Rowan said. "I haven't tried it yet." Clara laughed loudly, a real laugh, the kind that came from the chest. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you have." The thing that Rowan had not predicted about her own life at Ironwood, the thing that had not been part of any calculation she made when she walked down that road, was how much the place itself would come to matter to her. Not the money, not the status, not even the security of it, though security was something she had wanted badly for a long time. The land itself. The particular quality of the light over the east pasture in the early morning. The way the kitchen smelled in winter when the stove had been going since 3 and the bread was done and the day had not yet started demanding things. She had not come here looking for home. She had come here looking for work. Somewhere in the months of labor and crisis and difficult men and financial documents and late evenings over ledgers, the two things had become the same. She thought about this occasionally and never tried to make it into a lesson, because she had lived long enough to know that the experiences that actually taught you something rarely announced themselves as lessons while they were happening. They just happened, and then later you understood them, and the understanding was quieter than you expected. In the second summer of her marriage, Grayson came to her with an idea. He stood in the kitchen doorway, his position for important things, she had noticed, the doorway, as if he needed the option to retreat, and he said, "I want to talk to you about something, not an estate matter, something else." She turned from the stove. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said once, about how you left Decatur because there was nowhere to go that was safe." She waited. "There are women in that position all across this region," he said, "right now. Women with children, women alone, women who have lost something or had something taken and have nowhere that's going to hold still long enough to let them rebuild." He came into the kitchen. "I want to use part of the north pasture, the section past the creek that we're not running cattle on. I want to build something there." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly. That's why I'm talking to you." He sat down. "You'd know better than I would what a woman in that situation actually needs. Not what's charitable, what's useful." She thought about the question seriously, the way he'd presented it. Not charity, useful. She thought about what she had needed in the livery stable outside a town she didn't want to name, with $2.60 and her mother asleep in the Ironwood listing in a month-old newspaper. She had not needed someone to feel sorry for her. She had needed work she was capable of, a place to put her things down, and enough time to think. "Work," she said. "Real work, not made-up work, something with an outcome attached. She leaned against the preparation table. A kitchen garden they manage themselves. Animals, maybe, if there's space, chickens at minimum. Somewhere the children can be occupied in learning while the mothers work. She thought further. And it can't be separate from the estate. The women who come there can't feel like they're in a charity ward separated from the rest of the world. They need to be part of something that's going and going well. Gans. Grayson looked at her steadily. You've thought about this before. I've lived the version of it where none of it existed, she said. That's enough to know what it should look like. He nodded slowly. Will you run it? I'm already running a kitchen for 40 men, she said. I know. I'll oversee it, she said. I'll set it up, but the women who come need to run it themselves as fast as possible. That's the point. Not to give them a place to be taken care of, to give them long enough to find their own footing. She looked at him. You understand the difference. I do, he said. And she believed him, because he was a man who had run a large operation for a long time, and who understood, better than most, that the goal of good management was to make itself unnecessary. The first structure went up in the fall. It was not grand. Grayson had wanted to build larger than Rowan said to build. They argued about this in the manner they argued about most things, directly, without cruelty. Both of them saying their reasons plainly, and neither of them backing down from a position until the other had actually persuaded them. Larger means more maintenance, she said. More maintenance means more money. More money means the whole thing becomes dependent on your continued goodwill, and the day something happens to you or the day you need the money elsewhere, the whole thing collapses. Nothing's going to happen to me. Something happens to everyone eventually, she said. Build what they can maintain. Scale up when there's reason. He built what she said to build. The first women arrived in October. 2 of them, to start, a woman named Ruth, who had come from East Texas with a 7-year-old daughter and a 6-month-old son, and a younger woman, barely 20, named Cecile, who had a particular skill with animals that became obvious within a week, and who took over the chicken operation with an efficiency that made Rowan quietly pleased. Ruth was wary. She was the kind of wary that comes from being disappointed by offered help enough times that you stop trusting the offer. She did the work she was given without complaint and kept her children close and did not say much to anyone in the first 2 weeks. Rowan did not try to draw her out. She remembered what it was to be wary in a new place, to be saving your trust up rather than spending it, because you'd been overdrawn before. She gave Ruth the same thing Curtis had given her on the first day: work to do and a place to put her things. On the 3rd week, Ruth came to the main kitchen to return a pot she'd borrowed. She stood in the doorway. The doorway, Rowan thought, everyone important came through the doorway. And she said, "How long were you here before you stopped waiting for it to go wrong?" Rowan thought about it honestly. "About 3 months?" Ruth looked at the kitchen. "Did it go wrong first?" "Several times." Ruth nodded. "What did you do?" "I documented everything," Rowan said. "And I kept cooking." It was not inspirational advice. It was just what she'd done. But Ruth looked at her as though it were the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a long time, which Rowan thought said something important about the difference between useful and inspirational. Ruth stayed. She was still at Ironwood 2 years later, managing the settlement kitchen with a capability that had surprised everyone except Rowan, who had recognized the look of a woman with more in her than circumstances had allowed her to show. Pierce, the young hand who had wanted to learn to read, came to Grayson one afternoon the following spring and told him he'd like to leave Ironwood to apprentice with a lawyer in the county seat, if Grayson could spare him. He had completed 2 years of evening school. He had been reading everything he could find. He was not, he said with characteristic bluntness, going to become a ranch hand who could read. He was going to become a lawyer who had once been a ranch hand, and he hoped Grayson would understand the difference. Grayson gave him his wages through the end of the month and a letter of reference and a firm handshake. That evening he told Rowan, and she said, "I know, he told me 2 months ago. I told him to talk to you." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was his thing to say," she said. "Not mine." Grayson looked at her for a long moment. "You're always doing that," he said, "handing things back to people." "It's not my story to tell," she said. I have enough of my own, Batch. The thing about Fletcher Heller was that he did not disappear entirely. Men like Heller rarely disappeared. They contracted. He lost the accounts he lost, absorbed the financial damage, and pulled back to a smaller operation in the southern part of the county. He was still there. He still attended association meetings, though his voice carried less weight than it had before. He looked at Grayson across rooms with the particular expression of a man who had not forgiven losing and was not going to, and Grayson looked back at him with the expression of a man who had moved on and found moving on to be the more practical option. He came to Rowan once, indirectly. She was at the County Dry Goods Exchange in Merritt, a quarterly event where suppliers and buyers negotiated arrangements for the season, and she encountered one of Heller's remaining associates, a man named Briggs. Not her Briggs, the one Grayson had dismissed, but a different Briggs, equally unhappy with her for different reasons. He said to her, in the way that men like him said things, sideways with a smile, that it must be convenient to have married well. She looked at him and said, I didn't marry convenience. I married a man I respect, who respects me. The estate's finances were in order before the wedding. She picked up the supply invoice she had been reviewing. If you'd like to talk about pricing on your salt delivery, I have about 10 minutes. He did not have anything further to say. She finished the exchange and drove back to Ironwood in the afternoon sun, and she thought not for the first time about the particular kind of freedom that came from having nothing left to prove. It was not the freedom of someone who had never been tested. It was the freedom of someone who had been tested thoroughly and had found out what they were made of and could live with the answer. She had not come through everything she had come through and emerged as a better person in the clean, simple way that stories sometimes implied. She was still impatient. She still kept records because she trusted documentation more than she trusted people, which was a practical instinct and also, she knew, a legacy of being burned. She still sometimes lay awake running numbers in her head when she should have been sleeping. She had a sharp tongue that she managed but did not always manage well. And Grayson had been on the receiving end of it once or twice in their marriage and had the good sense to wait for her to finish before responding. She was not the kind of woman who had been rescued. She had never needed rescuing. She had needed a kitchen and 43 men who were hungry enough to give her a fair chance at proving what she could do, and she had taken that chance and built on it every day without waiting for anyone to tell her she had permission. What Grayson had given her was not safety in the way that people sometimes meant that word, the padded, restricted safety of someone else controlling the circumstances. What he had given her was the kind of safety that came from being genuinely known and genuinely kept, which were different things and rarer. She had given him the same back. She thought it probably looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside, the way most marriages did. Edith died in the winter of the 3rd year. It was not sudden. Her heart had been weakening through the fall, and the doctor from San Antonio had come twice and had been honest both times about what he was seeing. She died in the room that had been cleared of storage to make space for her on the first day Rowan arrived, in the bed Grayson had brought from the main house when her own wore out, with Rowan beside her and the Texas winter pressing cold and indifferent against the window. She had been 74 years old. She had put up preserves the previous summer. She had held strong opinions about the settlement kitchen's chicken coops and had not kept those opinions to herself. She had watched her daughter build something from nothing in a place that had not expected her, and she had said the last time she had been well enough to say much that she was satisfied, not happy, not grateful, not at peace. Satisfied, which was the word Edith Mercer would have chosen because she had always preferred accuracy to comfort. Rowan missed her in the specific cellular way you miss someone who has been present for your entire life. Not just for what Edith had done or said, but for the fact of her, the particular weight of her in a room. Grayson did not try to fill that space or talk her out of the grief, which was exactly right. He sat with her when she wanted company and left her alone when she needed that. And he brought her coffee at odd hours and said nothing, and it was the most useful thing he could have done. Hector came to the kitchen the day after. He did not say anything about Edith, not directly. He asked if there was anything that needed doing. She gave him a task. He did it, and when he was finished, he stood at the kitchen door and said, "She was a good woman." "Yes," Rowan said. "Knew her own mind," he said. "Always," Rowan said. He nodded and went back to work. She turned back to the stove, which was the thing she always turned back to, and she cooked for 40-some men and the women at the settlement and whoever was passing through, and she let the grief be present alongside the work without trying to resolve the one with the other, because they did not resolve. They coexisted, the way most important things did. The settlement grew in the way that things grown from real need tend to grow, not in a straight line but organically, with setbacks and adjustments, gaining ground season by season. By the end of the third year, there were 12 women and 19 children at the settlement past the creek. The kitchen garden had expanded twice. Cecile had negotiated her own livestock arrangement with a neighboring farm, which she had done without asking Rowan or Grayson first, and which Rowan had found out about 3 weeks after the fact, and had said absolutely nothing about because it was exactly what she had hoped would happen. 2 women had left the settlement to establish themselves independently. One to a neighboring town where she had family, one to a second marriage that she had entered carefully, and as far as Rowan could tell, wisely. 3 more had taken on work at Ironwood proper, in capacities beyond the settlement, and their wages were their own. Ruth was managing the settlement day to day by the end of the second year, which meant Rowan's involvement had shifted from operational to occasional, checking in, consulting on problems, being available. Not running it. It was Ruth's operation now, in the ways that mattered. Rowan had told her, at the start of the second year, "The goal is for you to need me less, not more. If I'm still making every decision here by next year, I've done this wrong." Ruth had looked at her with an expression that was partly rueful and partly relieved. "Most people who give help want to keep giving it," she said. "Makes them feel important." "I have enough things to feel important about," Rowan said. "You can have this one." Caldwell's daughter, who had attended the wedding and whom Rowan had spoken to exactly twice, came to Ironwood in the spring of the 4th year. She was 23 and had recently left a situation that she described briefly and without detail, and she was looking for work and a place to land. Rowan put her in the settlement kitchen for 2 weeks. Then she moved her to the main kitchen because the woman, her name was Frances, had a precision with quantities and timing that reminded Rowan uncomfortably of herself at 23, which was either a good sign or a warning depending on the day. Frances took to the work with a seriousness that the other hands noticed. She didn't talk much. She asked questions that were direct and waited for direct answers. She was, Rowan noted, keeping her own records, a small notebook tucked near her workstation. She didn't mention it. She recognized the habit. It took 3 months for Frances to ask the question she had clearly been building toward. She came to Rowan on a Tuesday morning when the kitchen was quiet between meals and said, "How did you know you could trust him?" "Hawthorne." Rowan looked up from the account she was reviewing. She thought about the question seriously. "I didn't know," she said. "Not at first. I watched how he treated the men who couldn't do anything for him. The older hands, the ones past their most useful years. He kept them on. He didn't make production out of it. He just kept them on and paid them the same. That told me something." "But that's business," Frances said. "That could have been strategy." "It could have been," Rowan agreed. "What changed it from maybe strategy to probably genuine was that he asked for my opinion before he needed it, not after. Men who are strategic about kindness don't ask women for opinions until the women have proven their worth 10 times over. He asked me about the suppliers in the 3rd week." She paused. "That was unusual. I noted it." Frances looked at her notebook. "You documented it." "I documented everything," Rowan said. "That's separate from trusting people. Documentation is a habit. Trust is a decision. You make it on available evidence, and then you make it again every day, and sometimes the evidence changes and you have to adjust." She looked at Frances. "There is no version of this that doesn't require making a decision without knowing how it will end." Frances thought about this. "That's not very reassuring." "No," Rowan said. "It isn't." She closed her accounts ledger. "But you're here, which means you already know that certainty is a luxury. You've been making decisions without knowing how they'd end for a while now." Frances was quiet. Then, "How do you know they'll be worth it?" "You don't," Rowan said. "You find out." The spring of the 4th year brought 2 things that arrived, as important things often did within a short time of each other. The first was a letter from Merritt County's new territorial representative, a man named Aldous Price, who had been elected the previous autumn. He wrote to Grayson formally, but the substance of the letter was about the settlement. He had heard about it, from Caldwell, Rowan suspected, though Price didn't say. and he wanted to discuss whether the model could be replicated at the county level. He used words like initiative and regional model and public-private cooperation, which Rowan read as a politician discovering something that had existed for 2 years and thinking of ways to take some portion of credit for it. But the interest was real, and the interest meant resources, and resources were useful. She wrote the reply herself, at Grayson's request. She was clear about what the settlement was, privately run, with specific principles attached, and what it was not. She said the county was welcome to visit and observe and to develop its own initiatives, but that the Ironwood settlement would remain independently managed and would not take county direction in exchange for county money. She was polite about it. Clarity delivered politely was its own kind of power. The second thing was that she found out she was expecting a child. She told Grayson on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen, which was where they had all their important conversations. She told him simply and without preamble, because neither of them had ever been served by preamble. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered, briefly, whether she had misjudged his reaction. Then he said, How do you feel? Uncertain, she said, and not quite prepared. And she stopped, started again. I'm 40 years old, Grayson. I know. The doctor will have things to say about that. I know. He reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't say it would be fine, which she appreciated because he didn't know that and neither did she. And they were not the kind of people who said things they didn't know. He just held her hand, and that was the correct thing. All right, she said after a moment. All right, he said. It was a negotiation with the unknown, and they entered it the same way they had entered everything else, with clear eyes and without pretending the uncertainty wasn't real. The pregnancy was difficult in the middle months, in ways the doctor from San Antonio described plainly, and that Rowan endured with the same determination she had brought to everything else, which did not make it easier but did mean she did not waste energy on denial. She could not do everything she normally did. This was genuinely hard for her, harder than she expected, because she had organized her entire adult life around being capable, and she found that being obligated to ask for help with ordinary tasks created a particular frustration that she had to consciously manage. Grayson managed it with her and did not make her feel managed, which was a skill she had not known to look for and found she was deeply grateful for. Frances ran the kitchen in the hard months. Ruth ran the settlement. Curtis ran the ranch. And Ironwood continued because it had been built as a thing that could continue, not as a thing that depended entirely on any one person's daily presence. She understood, lying in the room she had made her own, listening to the sounds of the estate going on without her, that this was what she had actually built. Not the accounts, not the supply arrangements, not the financial documents that had defeated Heller. Those were the tools. What she had built was a place that ran on its own values, that had been shaped by the way she approached work and people and problems until those approaches were embedded in the place itself. That was the thing you couldn't document and couldn't put in a ledger. It was the thing that outlasted any individual person's effort, if you did it right. She had not known she was doing it. She had been too busy doing it to know. Beb, her daughter, was born in the autumn, small and loud and entirely her own from the first moment. They named her Clara, for Rourke's wife, who had shown up at the house with no advance notice the day after the birth, in exactly the manner Rowan expected from her, and who had held the baby with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this many times and who had looked at Rowan and said, with uncharacteristic gentleness, "She's got your eyes." "I hope that's all she gets from me," Rowan said. "No, you don't," Clara Rourke said. She was right. Rowan didn't. Grayson held his daughter with a care so concentrated it was almost painful to watch. He was not a man who wore feeling easily on the outside of himself, and the feeling he had about this small person had no container he'd ever needed before. He held her and looked at her and said nothing for a long time. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said finally. "Neither do I," Rowan said. "That's usually where we start." He looked at her. There was something in his face she recognized, the expression she had first seen in the kitchen doorway the night after the Prescott meeting, when he had said her name and stayed to sit with her while she finished the document, open and uncertain and completely genuine. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We will," she said. "We generally do chemin." There is a particular kind of person, and they exist in every generation, in every place people have tried to build something from nothing. who arrives somewhere with less than anyone would consider sufficient and proceeds to make the place better than it was. Not through luck, not through simplicity of character or lack of fear, but through the consistent and largely unglamorous application of effort and attention and the refusal to accept that the story someone else has written about them is the true version. Rowan Mercer had been that person. She was still that person. She would be that person tomorrow and the day after that, because it was not a state she arrived at and then rested from. It was who she was when she got up in the morning and who she was at the end of the day and everything in between. She did not feel like a success story because she was not finished. She had a daughter who was going to grow up with questions she couldn't anticipate. She had a settlement that was working but was fragile and would remain fragile in the way that any human enterprise was fragile, because it was made of people and people were fragile. She had a marriage that required daily attention because it was between two people who were both stubborn and both right about different things often enough that the maintenance of it was real work. She had a kitchen that was hers, genuinely hers, not because of the wedding ring, but because she had walked into it empty-handed and made it what it was. And she ran it every morning and most evenings, and she was still precise about the accounts and still kept records of everything, because the habits that kept you standing were not habits you abandoned just because things were better now. She still had her grandmother's skillet. It hung on the same hook it had always hung on. She moved it when she moved, which meant she had moved it 0 times since arriving at Ironwood, because she had arrived and she had stayed, which was the decision she had made and remade every day. On a morning in the 5th year, early enough that the light was still low and the household had not yet started its day, she was in the kitchen alone. Clara asleep, Grayson not yet down from the room, the hands not yet in from the bunkhouse. And she was making the morning's first batch of bread. She had done this so many times that her hands knew it without her directing them, and she stood at the preparation table in the particular stillness of early morning in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and warmth. And she thought about nothing specific and everything at once, the way you do when a thing has become so ordinary that it lets you be quiet inside it. She thought briefly about the livery stable, about the $2.60, about the newspaper listing and the letter she had written by someone else's lantern, not hoping too hard because hope was a trap she'd fallen into before. She thought about the fact that you couldn't have told her then what she would be doing now, and that she would not have believed you. She thought about what her mother would have said about all of it, which was probably something accurate and dry and marginally reassuring. She shaped the bread and put it in the oven and stood back from the heat and listened to the sounds of the estate beginning its morning, and she felt the thing she had felt for some time now. Not satisfaction exactly, not happiness exactly, but something underneath both of those things. The solid ground of a life that was genuinely hers, built from the inside out, not given, not inherited, not settled for. Earned. Every day of it, still earning it. She picked up her grandmother's skillet and hung it back on the hook where it always was, and she got to work.